great. Thanks, Vivian. And thanks to the organising committee for making space for this hybrid approach to the conference. I really appreciate having a bit more flexibility in joining conferences. And I join you today from Musqueam Territory in Vancouver, Canada. I want to say a big thank you for the opportunity to share research on behalf of my team. We at the University of British Columbia have been partnering and working with the Canadian Institutes of Health Research now for about 5 years, evaluating peer review and issues of equity in peer review. And today I'm going to report some data from CIHR, which is the major national health research funder in Canada, as some of you may know. And I'm really pleased to share the results of our study where we evaluated a novel approach to allocating research grant funding. My colleagues Matthew Hogle, Alana Brown and Adrian Mota were at the time and still are employed by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and Karim Khan was seconded from his role as a professor at UBC to serve as scientific director for one of CIHR's 12 institutes, and he'll conclude that term at the end of this month. And as I mentioned, CIHR is a public research funding agency in Canada, and the organisation had no role in deciding whether or not to present these results. So as I mentioned, this was a study looking at an alternative way of allocating grant funding, an intervention that we've called Equalization, and CIHR introduced this intervention in 2016. In the next couple of slides, I'll explain a little bit of the context of peer review in the organisation and also how Equalization works. Before I get there, I want to set the scene a little bit about how this intervention has come about. So between 2016 and 2021, CIHR equalised for early career researchers, and then in 2021, the organisation expanded the intervention to cover female principal applicants and also principal applicants who were applying in French, which is an official language of Canada. Now, as you all in the room know, there are various biases at play in journal peer review and also in grant peer review. And as I mentioned, we study those biases. I won't go into the specific biases, but safe to say, as some of you may know, some funding organisations have looked at different ways of allocating research grant funding. I'll note the New Zealand Health Research Council and the Swiss National Science Foundation that have both used different approaches to lotteries or partial randomisation to try and overcome some of the biases in grant peer review. As far as we could tell though, CIHR is the first or is the only funder that we are aware of to use this equalisation approach. So we thought it was important to disseminate the results of the intervention. So in this study, that was our goal. It was to describe the outcomes of the equalisation intervention as it was applied in 2022. Now, I want to start with a little bit of context to the project grant competition, CIHR's project grant competition, which is the primary national mechanism for providing research operating funding in health research in Canada. So if you like, it's the equivalent of the R01 in the NIH, and it's this competition where the intervention has been applied. There are 2 competitions held each year, one in spring and one in autumn, and they each receive around 2,500 applications, although that number has been increasing over the last couple of years. And for peer review in each of these competitions, there are around 60 peer review committees constituted with about 20 members in each committee. The members evaluate the applications assigned to the committee, and the peer reviewers are asked to score grants on a scale from 0 to 4.9, where a higher score is better, which is the opposite to the NIH's scale. A score of 3.5 is considered fundable, although for most funded grants, they're receiving a score well in excess of 4.0, typically 4.1, even 4.2. And then once the committees have done their work and scored all of the applications, the score then is converted to a percentage rank, and that's done to account for differences in scoring patterns across each of these 60 committees. And it also ensures that an approximately proportionate number of grants are funded across each of the 60 different committees. The goal of equalising is to match the proportion of funded applications to the proportion of applications that have been submitted by particular historically underrepresented groups in science. And it is important to point out, and for you to keep in mind as you're looking at the results, that equalisation is applied on the competition level, not at the individual committee level. Now, as I mentioned, equalisation is trying to address some of the biases in grant peer review. It's clearly not addressing all of them, and it's doing that by trying to match the application pressure, if you like, to the funded proportion for these different underrepresented groups in the scientific enterprise. Now, in the CIHR approach, the way that this works is that after the peer review committees have done all of their work in the project grant competition, the organisation then funds application, or they take a list of the applications in rank order. They fund from the highest ranked application as far down the list as possible, within the budget of around 350 million Canadian dollars per competition. And it's only once that funding is allocated that the organisation CIHR then looks at the proportion of funded applications in each of the historically underrepresented groups of scientists and identifies where, if at all, equalisation is needed to match that application pressure as far as is possible. And I really want to emphasise that equalisation doesn't bump anyone out of the competition. So if someone was funded in that initial pass of funding, they don't get displaced. The grants that are funded under the equalisation intervention are added. So if you like to think about a different pot of money from which the funding is coming for these equalised interventions. So no one's getting displaced. And that's really important to keep in mind with this intervention. So as I said, in this study, we were aiming to describe the results of the intervention as it was applied to the Spring 2022 project grant competition. And in the next two slides, I'll share the number of funded applications before and after equalisation and the success rates, or the proportion of funded grants before and after equalisation. Now, what you're looking at here is the primary outcome of the number of funded grants, and you'll see that in the Spring 2022 project grant competition, there were just over 2,000 applications submitted and 370 grants that were funded. An additional 35 grants were funded or added after the equalisation intervention was applied, and you can see those numbers depicted in the bar chart. The numbers are a bit easier to see for the early career researchers and the female principal applicants. For French language applicants, there were 4 grants funded before equalisation and an additional grant added after equalisation. And the numbers in the bar chart don't quite add up to 35, and that's because there's intersectionality in these different underrepresented groups. So the number of people who are funded is slightly different to the number of applications funded. And then what you're looking at here is a dot plot depicting the success rate before and then after equalisation for each group. And blue dots for early career researchers, orange dots for females, and pink dots for French applications. The funding success rate rose for each of these 3 underrepresented groups from 17 and 18% before equalisation to 20, 21 and 22% after the equalisation intervention was applied. And the dashed line illustrates the overall competition success rate, and that was 19%. So, as you've seen, the equalisation intervention that the Canadian Institutes of Health Research used in 2022 did increase the number of grants and the proportion of successful grants for the 3 underrepresented groups. It was the case for early career researchers, for female principal applicants, and for principal applicants applying in French. And again, this was in the main operating grant competition for the National Public Health Research Funding Agency. And then since this competition, CIHR has started equalising for 2 additional underrepresented groups: people who identify as a racialised person and principal applicants, or people who identify as a person with a disability. And we're watching those outcomes with interest and looking forward to analysing the results. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Claire. So, we're open for questions. Looking around the room here, can you see the room, Claire?
I see you. Oh, now I see the room.
Okay, let's start over there, and then, so it's 1, 2, and 3, right?
Right. Yes, Florence Craw, Georgia State University. First of all, I want to clarifying questions. So your Equalization Act not only includes geography, location, but sex. Is that correct?
The equalisation is not geography, so it applies across Canada. Applicants can apply in French language or in English language to the research competition.
So it has more to do with equalization of what language you speak. But is
Yes, correct.
female, or is that not considered?
Sorry.
Equalization also, do they consider the sex on who's equalizing funding, or is it just French and English language?
No, it's for language, so French or English, sex, male or female, and early career researcher versus not early career researcher, mid and senior career researchers.
So my question then is, like in the United States, the Supreme Court ruled against Harvard and Chapel Hill that affirmative action is over, but they do allow geographical issues and socioeconomic. And in a former one about 20 years ago, they do not allow affirmative action for boys, you know, because anyway, sex is not one. What's going on with Canada? Are you getting much fight about that? Or is it going through the courts about this is not fair to us because we're favored the way it went through the courts in the US?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't believe so, Florence.
Thank you. Two.
Hi, Carol Lee from the University of Washington. Can you say a little bit about the kinds of topics or methodologies that may have tracked with different kinds of social identities like gender, and maybe, you know, what got included that might not have otherwise have gotten included content-wise in science as a result of these funding equalization measures?
Thanks for your wonderful question, Carol. I can't say anything based on the data we have that I've presented today. This is something we're really interested in and looking at into the future. So it's top of our research project priority list. So I hope to have more information about that in the future. Given there is a little bit of study in this field, looking at the types of research questions, particularly early career researchers and racialized researchers ask and study, and it looks like there are some differences. So one might hypothesize that we might see some differences, but we just don't know. So we're looking to study that in much more detail.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I'm Alex Goldberg from Carnegie Mellon University. And I was wondering if I understood correctly, your equalization is matching the percent funded to the percent who applied. Do you have any sense of what the numbers look like for the percent who applied for each of these groups and whether it matches, let's say, like the distribution of junior like faculty in these areas?
We have those numbers. I don't have them off the top of my head, Alex, but we do have a sense of it. It really comes down to the identifying questions that are asked of the researchers when they submit applications to the agency. And as you can appreciate, there are certain questions that are asked and certain that are not. So we're relying on descriptive or on self-reported data that we're reporting here. So there's only so much detail at which we can even analyze. The early career researcher group is simply based on the year that the person identifies was their first independent research appointment. So typically their first faculty job from that point 5 years forward. So it's a blunt way of characterizing early career researchers. It's also important to point out postdoctoral researchers and someone who's not in a faculty position cannot apply as a principal applicant to the project grant competition. So I know that's not directly answering your question. I think the short answer is we don't have the depth and the richness of data that we would need to really dive into all of these questions simply from the data that are collected at the funding agency level. But as I mentioned in the last response, we are looking at interviewing some of these researchers, looking at their open science practices, looking at their research impact and trying to quantify some of these metrics in a way that much better aligns with DORA. I think the challenge is that there's very little data out there on research agencies and their funding practices. So we're trying to boost that and contribute a little bit more.
Thank you. Do we have questions from the virtual world?
We have at least one question from the virtual world. Thank you for your presentation. I think in the other presentation, someone mentioned intersectionality, and the question comes from Gerben Terriet from the Netherlands. about multivariable approaches either to the analysis or to the project? Have you considered equalizing for those who are both early career and female and French speaking, or some combinations of those variables?
Thanks for the question. Yes, we have considered it. At this point, we're simply describing the results because this is not a prospective analysis. So we're in discussions with the funding agency, and this has been part of our long-term partnership, is to study the peer review process in the funding agency and then look at where we might be able to intervene in a more prospective way. As you can imagine, there's lots of challenges with intervening in the largest funding in the country for health researchers. So there's a lot of people who are really hesitant to get involved in randomized controlled trials. I'm aware that some people have done things like hold mock peer review committees where you can study some of the issues that come up in the peer review process. So the short answer is yes, we're really interested in using more sophisticated analysis techniques. We were limited with the numbers we had in this data set, but we are looking at accessing more of the data as we continue with this work.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, Matt Goldrick from Northwestern. I was wondering about how this information is provided to the applicants. So they must know about the equalization scheme at application. Do they know any information about whether the scheme was applied to them, or is that information shared with anyone outside of the review process?
Thanks, Matt. It's a really thoughtful question. The answer is no. If you receive funding in the competition, you don't know whether you received it in that initial round or whether you received it as a result of having the equalisation intervention applied to you. So no one outside of the CIHR staff knows that. Not even the peer review committees know that.
Okay, I'll go for a question since we still have a few minutes here. I love the name, Equalization. You know, it's really great. But I'm wondering about this extra fund. So is it like a separate fund, or is it part of the original itemization for the competition? Because you stress that nobody is sort of getting thrown under the bus because of equalization, and I get that. But what if you have to equalize for a lot? Do you have the funds for that? Where do you get it from? What's happening behind the scenes?
So thanks, Vivian. I will stress that I'm at the University of British Columbia, not employed by CIHR. So some of these decisions are at the funding agency, and I'm not privy to some of those decisions, but I'll try to answer as best I can. As far as I understand it, there is a separate pot of money that is allocated to equalising. I think ultimately we all understand that research funding is finite. So yes, if you ended up having to equalise for so many different characteristics and you were equalising so much, then it would have to, by definition, eat into the overall funding budget. But I think the point I wanted to make here is that it wasn't that the equalisation was applied as a second step, not as part of that first step of allocating the research funding. So I think in a sense, maybe both are true, that if you did have to equalise enough, then of course it does eat into that budget, simply because we can't possibly fund every application that is worthy of funding, unfortunately.